Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Julia Simpson. I'm one of the psychologists here at Alpine Pediatrics, and I'm going to be doing the presentation with you guys tonight. As you can see, tonight we're going to focus actually primarily on autism. We will touch briefly, let me bring up that slide for you all. We will touch briefly on learning disability as well as intellectual disability towards the end of the presentation, but a good bulk of this presentation will be focusing on autism. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what to expect, with each of these diagnoses, we will define them and talk about the criteria that's used in our diagnostic manual as psychologists, as well as we'll touch briefly on interventions that you may be able to do at home, but also interventions that are available to you in the community. Okay, so we'll start with autism. This is the DSM criteria that you can see on the slide. So the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That is kind of the diagnostic Bible, for lack of a better term to use, that we psychologists use to diagnose different psychological disorders. So these are the criteria that a person or an individual would have to meet in order to be able to be diagnosed with autism. Essentially what we're looking for is we're looking for two groups of symptoms or characteristics. So as you can see there at letter A, we're looking for deficits in social communication or social interaction, and that can be a number of different things. So the older that kids get, one of the characteristics, for example, that we're looking for is not just are they interested in social relationships and can they talk to others, but also whether or not they can carry what we call a reciprocal conversation or a back and forth conversation. So are they able to comment on another person's experience as well as ask questions about that, as well as be able to talk about their own experience. And then as you can see, some of the other things there are we're looking for nonverbals that would relate to social communication, like eye contact or use of gestures or change in facial expression, as well as the extent to which they have an understanding for the nature of different social relationships. Naturally, the younger that kids are and maybe the less verbal they are, the less conversational they are. In testing, we would be looking for more of the nonverbal signs of social reciprocity and interaction rather than the verbal signs. But as individuals get older, and then obviously here I primarily test children and teens, so like late childhood, teenage years, adolescence, we're looking at more, not just their nonverbals, but also their conversational ability. And we'll talk a little bit about the testing as well on a future slide. So the other group of behaviors and characteristics we're looking at are probably the behaviors or the symptoms that people may find more stereotypically related to autism. And so with this one, it does, the manual does specify that the person has to be presenting with at least two or have had at least two of these characteristics at some point in their development. So for example, this is where someone's sensory concerns would fall under, and that's not just like their sensory aversions. So for example, that they're really overwhelmed by loud sounds. It could also be that they are sensory seeking in some way. So like a child that really seeks out a lot of physical input. It's also commonly the things where kids might have really restricted interest. So an interest or hobby that may be typical or common for their age and seem age appropriate, but that it's very intense in how much focus they dedicate to that interest. So what that means is they might spend a lot of time doing it, or they might think about it a lot, or they might research it a lot, or it just might be like the ultimate topic of their conversation. Other things that fit into this category are repetitive patterns of movement. Sometimes those can be specific to the hands or fingers, such as the traditional flapping, or maybe just shaking out of hands. It could also be whole body movements that are repetitive, such as pacing, running back and forth in the same pattern or direction. It could be spinning or bouncing, or anything just seems like kind of repetitive, almost in a fixated way, would fit into this category as well. And then as you can see, I haven't commented here on number 2, this is an insistence on sameness, or just that kind of difficulty being flexible across routines or behaviors. So this might mean that they have specific routines that have to be done in a particular way or order each day. And if even one thing is out of order, they're very upset about it and really have to go back to that and redo that step before they can move on. It could be that transitions or abrupt changes or abrupt introductions to the schedule are very difficult. It can also be things that are verbal related. So sometimes kids really prefer that things are said in a special way, or a particular way, I should say, and they will correct themselves or others in the way that words are said. For example, there's a book that I use in the testing, and I forever and always refer to the animals in the book as frogs, but I've learned over the years of administering the test that they're correctly toads. And so if I use frogs and kids know the characteristics between a frog and a toad, they will correct me every time and say, "You mean toad." And then it'll be hard for us to move on from that page until I've corrected myself and said toad. Another way that this can come out speech-wise is it's very hard for kids potentially to be interrupted, and so they may feel like they have to start all the way over at the beginning in order to get their thought out. So those are the characteristics and behaviors we're looking for when we're doing diagnosing. And then we'll go through the levels here, and then I can talk about the testing. So these levels are what we use clinically in terms of conveying where someone is at on the spectrum. And primarily this is really meant to convey how much support an individual child or adult requires when they're on the spectrum. We've really tried to stray away, especially clinically, but also I know that many people in the autism community feel very strongly about this as well. But we've tried to stray away from using words like mild, moderate, severe, or high functioning and low functioning, just because people have mixed opinions or insights or beliefs about what those mean. And also I know that many individuals I work with on the spectrum find those words very stigmatizing. But for example, when we refer to someone as high functioning, we may over-assume their strengths and under-assume their weaknesses, and vice versa for someone that we might refer to as low functioning. So we may not push someone that's low functioning or challenge them in a way because we assume weaknesses, and then we may miss their strengths. So we use these levels instead. Level 1, for lack of a better term, even though I just explained not to use mild, moderate, severe, but for lack of a better way to explain this, level 1 functions more like the mild end of things, where level 3 is the more severe end of the range. And then level 2 is somewhere in the middle. And so you can kind of read there and see what an example of each of those would look like. But level 1 is essentially someone that's doing okay in most areas of their life. They're probably in the traditional school classroom. They probably even have friends if they're interested in that, but you can tell that there's little subtleties in the way that they interact with people that may make those social interactions difficult for them, or there may be some subtle observations of that, let's see, letter B from before, those RRBs is what I typically refer to them as. So they're observable, but not getting in the way so significantly. So we call that requiring support because they would still benefit from support in the areas that they're struggling, but they may not need as much support as someone else on the spectrum. We'll jump up to level 3. This would probably be someone that's more nonverbal, probably has some delays maybe cognitively or in terms of just taking care of their activities of daily living. So this is a person that may or may not be able to live at least semi-independently. Oh, and one other note on diagnosis. So this is just the note actually taken directly from the DSM. And what it's trying to convey is they've actually removed a diagnosis of Asperger's disorder from the DSM. So what that means is that anyone that meets criteria for the diagnosis of autism, they now qualify just across the board as an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. Previously, I think people probably thought of Asperger's disorder as like more of a high functioning autism, and autism meant more low functioning. But kind of just shorthand, we realized through research that those diagnoses weren't really differentiating the way that we thought they were. In all honesty, the primary characteristic that was different was that for autism, one of the criteria was that individuals were delayed in speech prior to age 2, and Asperger's, for example, was that people were not delayed. But we're realizing that's not as differentiating as we originally thought, because, for example, many of the kids I test, some had language delays and some didn't. And they all have different strengths and weaknesses across the spectrum. So just know that if anyone is, previously, even if they had a diagnosis, if they were reevaluated now, if they had that diagnosis of Asperger's and were reevaluated now, they would probably fall under the category of autism spectrum disorder. I do want to point out here, one diagnosis they did add is social pragmatic communication disorder. This is essentially that criterion A without criterion B. So it's that they struggle with social communication and understanding of social skills and relationships, but they're not showing those RRBs. So the sensory concerns, the restricted interest, the rigidity in routine and behavior. One of my roles here at Alpine is that I do the autism evaluations here. I really appreciate being able to do thorough, testing and really try to pay attention to detail and make sure that we can offer the correct diagnoses. Because especially as it relates to autism, one thing that's important is there's a lot, well, probably as it's true for most mental health right now, but there's a lot more people that need resources than there are resources. And so a diagnosis has become a gatekeeping of sorts for many of the treatment programs that we have. So sometimes getting a diagnosis actually helps someone access more resources than they would have had access to originally. For some individuals, that might not change any of the resources they would have want access to. So sometimes it's just a personal decision between the child, and the parent, or the parents for the child, about what you feel like is best for you and your child and your family, about whether or not you would seek out a diagnosis. But often it can just open the door to resources that you may or may not need now or going into the future. The other thing is I think it's really helpful. Two more things. One is that I think it's really helpful for the individual, especially the older they get, because a lot of times kids will start to learn by observation that maybe the little quirks or the difficulties they have aren't the same as everyone else, and so they learn to mask or kind of suppress those, and they really try to throw themselves into looking like everyone else or being like everyone else, even though that's not their natural state. And so a lot of times then they internalize their differences, and it can impact their self-esteem or lead to more anxiety and more depression symptoms later in adolescence or adulthood. It's not always the case. It would definitely be correlational rather than causational, but it definitely can happen. So I think it's really helpful for people to get a diagnosis for themselves, because then they know, they have a name for what's going on for them, and a whole community of people that they can connect to, that they can kind of relate to and feel validated from, like, oh, there's other people that experience the world like I do. And then the last thing, that last bullet point I said, wrong labels can be damaging. So autism type behaviors and characteristics can overlap with a lot of different things. For example, these kids can come across as very defiant and maybe be misperceived as oppositionally defiant, meaning that they just really don't care about the rules and they just want to act out against the rules. However, I think for a child with autism, the defiance is coming from a much different place than that they just don't care about the rules. In fact, many of the kids that I work with on the spectrum actually care very much about the rules and take them in a very black and white way. But because of that rigidity, that's what makes them seem so, can make them seem so defiant. For example, someone I worked with a long while ago, their parent had said something to the effect of, "Can you take out the trash?" And so, and I think for most of us, be like, oh yeah, okay, that sounds like an easy command. And so literally, this child took the trash outside the door and then left it outside the door and just was like, okay, great, took out the trash. And then later they were kind of in this frustration arguing match because the child was very insistent that they did what the parent wanted. And the parent's like, what are you talking about? No, you didn't do that. And so, but they very literally did what they thought they were told. but then didn't think of, okay, what steps am I actually expected to take to officially achieve the goal of taking out the trash? So some people can kind of perceive that as like, wait, don't they understand what I'm saying? Like, that's so defiant, that's so rude, when really it just came from a complete misunderstanding. So I think a diagnosis that's accurate can just help us better understand and see the world through that child's perspective. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to talk a little about testing. I'll go over the testing process that I do here at Alpine. There are screeners available. So screeners are kind of brief questionnaires that are really used to get a sense of, okay, would further testing be warranted? An example is the social communication questionnaire, and I've used this one in the past. It's great because essentially it's just a quick overview of the typical signs and characteristics, almost like the criteria as it would relate to a diagnosis of autism. But it's like a very black and white overview, so you want to make sure that you have further evaluation, even if you were to test high on a screener, to look more into each of those symptoms and characteristics. So there's also rating scales you can use. So these are just like longer self-report measures that either sometimes can be filled out by the child themselves if they're old enough, but usually by the parent. Some of them are better used standalone. A lot of them are meant to accompany, again, further testing. What I try to do here is I try to use those bottom two measures. It says gold standard, quote unquote, not necessarily to convey it's the best we have or that it's all that we have, but it's essentially the best we have right now. So I should say that it's not that it's perfect, it's just these are the best measures we have right now. Where autism is a very socially related diagnosis, and a diagnosis is very much related to social weaknesses. One thing that's so key about the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or the ADOS, is that it's literally, as it says, it's an observational test. Not to say that there's not objective scoring, because there is. So at the end of all the tests, there's several pages of rating scales that I go through and very specifically rate behaviors I observed on those scales. However, what's so nice is you're actually putting kids into activities and situations within the test that kind of probes for very specific social behaviors you would expect based on their age and language ability. And then, like I said, you rate it at the end. So all of these tests are meant to be developmentally appropriate, and they're not, I almost hate using the word test because it's definitely not like a traditional test. Basically, so with younger kids, and it's actually not solely age-based either, it's definitely based on kids' language ability or adults' language ability, more so than it's based on even their age. But then you kind of take into account both to decide which level or which module of the testing you're going to do. But the younger kids it's very much more play-based. And then the older you get, it kind of is half play, half conversation, and then up to adulthood or older adolescence, then it's primarily conversational. The autism diagnostic interview is the parent interview. So again, it's a way to just gather more information and talk to the parent about what they've observed. However, then there are rating scales that you can use to score it and use it objectively as well. The reason that I use these two measures, like I said, is because they're kind of the best we have, but also from what I've found to this point, when insurances ask for very specific tests or even services that are available, when they ask for very specific tests, these are the two measures that I see most commonly asked for. However, I have started to see some other ones kind of pop up as options as well. Okay, so in terms of treatment, a lot of times, especially the younger that kids are, I'm recommending a comprehensive approach to treatment. We're lucky here in Utah because we do have quite a few what are called ABA or Applied Behavior Analysis programs. And so at the end of any evaluation that I do with someone, I have a whole handout of the ones that we refer to most commonly. However, you can also piece together the services that may be best for your individual child. So for example, it may be individual therapy just to work on some brief social skills, as well as like self-esteem or emotion regulation. A lot of times the social skills piece I think is best learned in group social skills therapies, or with a communication disorders or speech language specialist that has expertise in social communication, but particularly the group social skills, because oftentimes social interactions are related to being a part of a group and interacting as part of a group. So sometimes that's a nice way to also learn them in a more applied format rather than learning it in a more atypical format, like with the child one-on-one with a professional, and then it's really hard to apply outside of that situation. Other services that are often helpful to kids, obviously speech therapy I mentioned for social communication. If we have a younger child, or really any child that's nonverbal or delayed in their language, then speech therapy can also continue to help with that language development. Occupational therapy is fantastic for things like sensory concerns and emotion regulation of behavior that way. And then also usually it's helpful to get some resources through the school. At home, so similarly, I mentioned that handout that I give to everyone after they've done an evaluation with me. I've tried to combine in that handout all of the most common things I've recommended for people to try at home. But just a quick overview of some for this presentation. Things that you can try there are lots of books, particularly social stories books or even social stories comic books, that kind of outline or depict a specific social skill in a fun, visual, interactive way for the child. So I've listed a couple here. Another thing you can do is things I've done in the past in session. Let me think of some of those. So for example, tone of voice, especially when all the kids were wearing masks in school, we would practice talking to each other, maybe set a timer and practice a brief couple-minute conversation. And then we would record it and play it back to see if they could comment on, oh, did you notice anything about your tone of voice? Do you feel like it was loud enough with your volume? Do you feel like you could have changed it at certain points to seem like you were more emotionally engaged? And so we just kind of use different interventions that way. You can do the same thing with facial expressions by looking in the mirror, or you can even use a child's favorite book or their favorite story or their favorite television show or movie and use that as opportunities to comment on what they can read or tell from a person's facial expression or how they're talking about their emotions if it's a book without pictures. I also try to use really key phrases. And so what I mean by that is I try to use phrases that make sense as well as phrases that are consistent so that they know what that means. So some of my favorite ones are, I'll use things like trading common interests, right? So we'll kind of talk about finding common interests and then trading information, right? So finding a common interest means that we're looking, obviously, we're trying to search for what their interest is, and then we're trying to see if we can find one that's similar to ours. And then trading information is that we're going to literally trade back and forth talking about that interest. So again, I try to use these phrases that make literal sense to them and then use them consistently so it's always the same thing. That kind of speaks to another good point of something that I try to work on is conversations generally can seem very subjective to kids because it's just like, are there even parts to it? And so sometimes the first thing I do is I break down conversations into steps. And depending on the child, we may work on just one step per session. So for example, we may just work on greetings and entering into a conversation for one whole session. Or if it's a child that just really needed the steps outlined, we could work on all of those parts of the conversation in one day. The other thing that I do to help kids practice conversation is I have colored chips that I like to use, little just colored poker chips. And I'll set a timer, we'll practice conversation, and then each poker chip or each colored chip is assigned to a different kind of skill we're trying to use in the conversation. For example, it might be like offers information about yourself, chats or comments appropriately about something I said, or asks about something I said. And then I try to just like engage in the conversation, but then also assign chip colors to both of us. And then at the end, we kind of pay attention. So which technique did you use the most? Which one could we try to improve on or use more? And then we redo the intervention and practice that skill again. Okay. I also just wanted to point out a few things about some of those other behaviors we can commonly find in that are associated with autism. So for emotion regulation, I super love the Incredible 5-Point Scale book. You can find it on Amazon. It's, I'm pretty sure, pretty cheap and easy to find. But also, if you don't go out and buy the book, you can definitely use the tools that it implies. I use this for so many things with all the kids I work with, but then there's a variety of different ways I use it with kids on the spectrum. So essentially, it's literally just like a 5-point scale, right? So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If numbers aren't a kid's thing, you can put colors there, or you can have different words to assign to the levels. But basically how you're using it is you're helping kids kind of realize, okay, so for example, if we're using it emotionally, we're looking at emotions levels. Like, okay, so am I level 1, I'm calm. Level 5 is like when I'm totally overwhelmed, and if it's anger, maybe I'm exploding. And then level 3 is somewhere in the middle, right? And so level 3 is maybe our warning signs. And then you can help kids assign, like talk through what that emotion looks like what physiological cues are associated with it, or what does their face look like, or what does their body do. And then you can even assign coping skills. And now it's just become a roadmap for coping with that emotion. The other way I've used it is for topics of conversation. Sometimes to make it even simpler, I break it down into levels 1, 2, 3, or stoplight colors. So red, yellow, and green. And so for example, for topics of conversation, we'll talk about topics that are always okay, meaning green, sometimes okay, we got to be cautious about them, or red, never okay. And then the other way I've used it as well is for social behaviors. So behaviors that are always okay to do socially versus never okay versus sometimes okay. So that's just some fun ways to use that scale idea or that book. In terms of restricted interest, I hear a lot of people talk about how it can be frustrating, because if you have a child that's maybe going on and on about their favorite thing and you're like, man, I don't know anything about this. It's not that we ever want to get rid of that interest. Clearly that interest, as anyone's interest would, brings this child a lot of joy and comfort, but it's more so that we want to direct them on times that maybe it's okay and expected that we're going to talk about that, and then times that we need to take a break from that interest. So for example, you could kind of say, oh, well, right before dinner, I want to hear, for 10 minutes about, Godzilla or whatever it is. But then during dinner, we're going to take a break talking about Godzilla, and we're going to talk about each other's days. And then maybe after dinner, they can talk about Godzilla for another 10 minutes. That way you're helping them practice taking breaks from the topic. Restricted interest can also be great motivators at times as well for other behaviors that you're trying to get them to maybe engage in or complete, that they may have a lot less motivation for. And then, like I said, sensory sensitivities. Oftentimes in my therapy, I can work with helping to identify other tools and coping strategies, but I really believe that occupational therapy, particularly occupational therapists that specialize in sensory concerns, are probably the way to go for sensory concerns, particularly as it relates to autism. And we definitely have several places that we refer to quite frequently. So if you need a referral to a good occupational therapy center, let us know. Okay, these websites are the ones that are at the top of my handout that I give, that I keep mentioning. However, I also wanted to list them here because they're the ones that I go to myself most commonly. I've included BYU as well as UVU down at the bottom because both of them have excellent pages for autism and resources as it relates to the community. Also, both of them are trying to get involved with the community and offer resources to individuals directly. So those are great websites to check out to see what's available locally. The other websites, particularly the Utah Parent Center as well as the Autism Council, are state websites, so they're specific to Utah, but they're great just general resources as well as search engines to look for treatment or resources that are available near you. The Division of Services for People with Disabilities is a good website. If you anticipate needing state resources of any kind for your child, you can reach out to them because autism is a qualifying diagnosis. All right, so we're gonna jump into learning disabilities as well as intellectual disability just briefly, and then that'll bring us to the end of the presentation. So for learning disorder, you can do this with, you can kind of identify a learning disorder through psychological testing as well. We don't currently offer this testing at Alpine Pediatrics. A lot of times, one reason being that this is testing that you can receive through the school district. Also, if you ever need a referral or want it done privately, we can give you referrals for that as well. But essentially what we are looking at as psychologists is we are testing people, we're testing their intellectual ability, so their IQ, as well as their achievement ability. And then we're comparing those scores. So if someone's IQ score is average or above average, essentially what we're saying is, okay, this is what we assume they're capable of. If their achievement scores in areas such as reading, writing, or math are significantly below what their IQ score is, we're assuming that they're not achieving at the level that we would expect, and therefore we can diagnose a learning disorder. Our criteria in the manual I mentioned, the DSM, used to state that there had to be a very specific number that associated with the discrepancy, but now it's a little bit more subjective, where as long as there is a discrepancy of some sort in the scores and we can demonstrate that this discrepancy is interfering for the child in a very specific way or a very notable and obvious way, then we can diagnose a learning disorder in either reading, written expression, or writing and math. Also, it's nice because there's some qualifiers in the DSM that fall under each of those categories. So for example, with math, you can qualify whether it's like word problems or maybe more just numerical sense. And so you can kind of specify what exactly within this area is it that this person is struggling. I know at the school district they would do similar testing. Sometimes they have different criteria that they not necessarily use. I mean, like if it's a learning disorder, it's a learning disorder, but they may have different models that they use to diagnose that learning disorder. Okay. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment once we get through intellectual disability, because I have had some parents that are involved with the school district in past presentations give me some awesome feedback on that. So I'll do my best. I don't work for the school district, and that's not my area of expertise, but I will do my best to explain it to you all. But intellectual disability quickly. So this is essentially lower IQ, right? So they may or may not be achieving lower as well, but if their IQ is low, then we assume that they're achieving at the level we'd expect based on their IQ. It's not just low IQ though. We also see a corresponding deficit in adaptive functioning. So their ability to attend to their daily living skills and take care of themselves somewhat independently. So when we see that both of those scores are low, you can see the ranges there: mild, moderate, severe, profound, and those correspond to the levels that we would diagnose in terms of the type or the level of intellectual disability that we're looking at. And then it probably goes without saying, but down here at profound, these are the individuals, kind of similar when we're talking about the autism levels. Down here, we're looking at people that likely aren't living independently. But as we move up these scores, people may be able to live independently or at least semi-independently. Okay, so in terms of intervention, like I said, we are not currently offering the testing here. It's possible we could look into that in the future. But right now we do not for learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities. We do have plenty of people, colleagues in the community, as well as sites that we can refer you to. And we can also help you contact your school district. My understanding of the school district right now is that they are trying to do more of a response to intervention versus doing the testing first, because the testing through the school district in terms of getting all the testing done and then getting the child qualified for maybe and set up with an IEP can take a significant amount of time. Like my understanding is it can take up to a month or a month and a half. So in that amount of time, it's difficult to kind of decide, is it worth it that we prioritize the testing because the child might have fallen further behind. So if they see a child that's falling behind, what they try to do is they try to implement some interventions first. And if the child responds well to those interventions, then they continue with the interventions. If they're still having a lot of difficulty, then they would maybe circle back and implement the testing and get them set up on an official IEP. So if anyone is on, so don't respond just yet, we're almost to the question portion, but if anyone is on here from the school district and wants to correct anything that I said, please feel free to. I've also listed the common test that I see given or that I would give most commonly. So usually for the IQ test, As psychologists, I know we commonly give the Wechsler scales. For achievement tests, we commonly give the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. For adaptive functioning, I usually give the Vineland, and actually I do have access to this measure and use it a lot, especially for younger kids or kids that I know have had developmental delays when I'm testing for autism.